And welcome to Pasture 101 for sheep and goat producers. Can you hear me okay out there? Okay, thank you for letting me know. As Brenda Miller mentioned, my name is Brenda Postels. I'm with the University of Minnesota Extension. I'm an extension educator in Stearns, Benton, and Morrison counties. I'm also a farmer. I've raised hair sheep, meat goat, and I also consider myself a forage farmer as well, including pastures and hay production. So it's all of that is pretty important to me. And I am planning this to just be a basic pasture management class. According to our survey, it looked like at least half of you were beginning farmers. So I'm gonna start there. And if you have additional questions, as Claire and Brenda mentioned, please put those in the chat box and we'll try to answer those as we go along. So our objectives today are manage forage to meet the animal needs and to manage the pasture conditions and health. In order to be profitable, producers must be effective and efficient in feeding their animals. Profitable goat or sheep production is pasture browse based. So if you think about your cost of pounds of protein and energy, it's lowest in your predominantly pasture forage based systems. Good small ruminant producers are also good pasture forage producers that utilize the animals as a means to harvest their crops. So the more that you can do to improve your forage, the better off your animals will do and be. First of all, we're going to kind of take a look at nutrition. Feed accounts for the majority of the cost of raising sheep and goats, as I'm sure you're well aware. I mean, it can be upward to about 70% of your cost of production can go into the feed. And so anything that you can do to put into your pasture system is going to come out of the bottom line of your pocket. So let's, try to increase the nutrition based on your pastures. Nutrition is the foundation of good health. Animals on a higher plane of nutrition are more resistant to many diseases and parasites. You learned quite a bit about that when you, two presentations ago, when you listened to Joe Armstrong and Travis Hoffman, as well as last Tuesday, when Dr. Whitney talked about parasites. Now, diseases and parasites can greatly be affected by the nutrition of our animals. So the nutrition plays a great role. Nutrition has a large effect on reproduction as well. All animals have essential nutrient needs, which are, of course, water, energy, protein, minerals, and vitamins. And all of those can be obtained from a forage-based diet. So your small ruminant nutrient requirements. Now, your dry ewes, your does, your wethers, they have a low nutrient need. They don't need much to get them by and just to survive and to maintain. Now your higher nutrient needs, those would be your doe and your kid pairs, your ewes and your lamb pairs, breeding bucks and rams, lactating animals, of course, and your very high nutrients, those would be your dairy goats or dairy sheep. But just keep these in mind, the different nutrient needs for these animals as we go along in this presentation, because there's going to be different situations where we're going to want to hit those nutrient needs with our pasture systems. Before we go there, I want to take a look at what the dietary preference are, specifically with sheep and goats. Most of our conventional pasture systems are a majority of grass. We tend to develop them for cattle or horses. And, they like a lot of grass. As you can see, horses prefer about 90% of a grass-based diet. But we're talking about sheep and goats. Now let's look at the sheep. 60% of their diet preference is grass. About 30% of that is weeds or forbes. And they will eat some browse, about 10%. And then goats, look at how different that is. Goats only prefer about 20% of their diet to be grass. They eat a bit more weeds, but not even as many weeds or forbs as what a sheep would like to have. But they do like a lot of browse. They like to see lots of shrubs, trees, and things like that. So with that in mind, that's really what we should be looking at when we're planning our forage systems for these animals. Like I said, a lot of our conventional systems are built for horses or cattle. And what we do is we tend to put our sheep and goats into those same systems and expect them to thrive. Well, for one, that's not their dietary preference, and they may not be getting the nutrients that they need. And so we want to look at ways to do that better for them. So we're going to look at forage basics. Quality forage comes from planning, not from luck. So just having a little bit of understanding. Smart planning begins with just some simple understanding. So we're just going to go through some of these things just so you have a better understanding of why we are going to do what we'd like you to do so that your animals will best benefit. So we're going to talk about types of forages, varieties of forages, growth stages, soil, rainfall, and temperature. Some of these things you'll have great control over, and others obviously not so much. So types of forage. First of all, there's annuals and perennials. Annuals, as I'm sure you know, are just single season plants. They germinate, they grow. The plant's sole purpose is to reproduce and set seed, and then by the end of the season it dies off. Whereas your perennial, that one comes back year after year. And with the proper growth and conditions, it can last for many, many years. In addition, then we have grass, legumes, forbs, and brush. Grass, you're all familiar with grass. Those are blades of, in grass, and that would be like your smooth brome grass or your Kentucky bluegrass, canary grass, things like that. Your legumes, that would be like your alfalfa, clover, bird's foot trefoil. Legumes tend to be higher in protein, and they can also fix their own nitrogen. So whereas grass, we do need to supply them with some additional nitrogen in order to get them to grow. Legumes will create their own. And then we have forbs. Forbs are broadleafed plants, and that would be like a lot of your weeds are forbs. That would be like your dandelions, which are highly nutritious as well. And other plants would be maybe some wildflowers, like if you think about in a prairie type setting, a lot of those are forbs. And then a brush, of course, that would be like your trees, shrubs, all the things that goats like. So then stages of growth. It's really important to know the stages of growth in order to plan your rotational grazing systems, and in order to go back to look at the nutritional needs of different stages of development. We need to know the stages of growth, the stages of that plant development. So here's just a simple chart just to kind of explain the growth stages of a plant. I'm just going to pretend that this plant here is an alfalfa plant, but it could be anything. It could be grass. Grass also flowers. Could be a weed, and in this case, we'll consider it to be alfalfa. But over on the far left, let's say that's a seed. It sprouts. It starts off with a little tiny, leaf and a little tiny root, and then it slowly starts to grow. And you know what? Can you see my mouse on the page here? Can somebody answer me? Does that look like
yes.
Yep,
we can see your mouse.
Okay, wonderful, because I'm going to use that kind of as a pointer too as well. So anyways, so the grass the plant continues to grow, and the root elongates and the leaf structures start to grow. And as the plant is still down in this stage, it's getting most all of its food from the root, from the soil. And it hasn't really developed enough leaf structure at that point to photosynthesize and collect its own energy from the sun. So it really still depends a lot on its root. As it gets bigger and the root elongates even more, it provides a lot of structure for this plant, and then it's getting a lot more leaf surface. And then at this point, it's starting to produce a lot of its own food from the sunlight. And then into this stage, this is the vegetative stage. You can see there's lots of leaf surface on there. This plant is still fairly young, fairly tender. It's high yielding. And the main thing to know about this stage right here, it's highly nutritious for an animal, and it has a lot of production into it. The next stage, and this again is the stage that all plants thrive to get to. It's the reproductive stage. It's going to set some flowers, which are then going to go to seed, which is going to, in the case of an annual, complete its life cycle. It will then die after the next stage. Or in the perennials case, it will send all of it, after it reproduces, it will send all of its energy back down into its root system. The top will die off, but the roots will overwinter and then start all over again the next year. So that's kind of your growth cycle. Or not kind of, it is your growth cycle. Let's see, and with that in mind, oops, excuse me. So we need to keep that in mind when we want to start looking at nutrition of these grasses, okay? So in the beginning, when your plant is really young, as I mentioned, at the beginning, it has real shallow roots and not very many leaf structure or surfaces. However, it is very tender. And if you look at the y-axis here, you can see the smaller and younger the plant is, the more crude protein it has and the more minerals. However, if you were to graze that at that point, the smallest, the youngest point there, remember those root structure hasn't really developed yet. The plant can easily be pulled out of the ground, or because it hasn't really got to the point where it's producing its own food yet, it doesn't have a whole lot of energy in order to regrow if something grazes that. The animals would prefer to eat that right there because it's very young and tender and tasty and nutritious. However, that plant is just not strong enough to support that constant grazing. So we want to let that plant grow up. However, if we let it get too big and too old, as you can see, as it starts to age and it gets into where it's starting to produce that flower head, the fiber content really increases. You get a lot more lignin in the cell walls, and it's no longer palatable. And well, it is palatable, it's just not as palatable. It's not as easy to digest. There's a lot more stems and a lot more fiber. So at that point, most importantly, the nutritional content declines rapidly. You can see the crude protein and the minerals have greatly decreased. So with that being said, the point that you want to graze those animals for the most nutrition, the most palatability would be right in that middle area there, kind of right before they're going to flower. And that could also be said, that was in the case of an alfalfa plant, but that could also be said for grass, and it could also be said for shrubs and trees. And I just wanted to throw this in there because with goats, you can really extend your grazing system if you're using shrubs and trees and you're maybe doing some silver pasturing, but you need to manage them as well. And it's kind of on the same lines as with those grasses and those forbs and those legumes. Graze it later in the spring. You don't want to put your animals out there right away in the spring and start tearing off those tender leaves. It's going to make it a lot harder for those trees to grow out those leaves again. Leave a longer rotation for them. Let them rest once those leaves have been removed. Do not defoliate late in the fall. It has a much harder time recovering for next spring. And as anybody who raises goats knows, they can quickly pull off some bark and kill trees. So if you have some trees you really want to save, you might need to fence those off. Okay, I'm going to talk about forage varieties a little bit here. If you're seeding a pasture, if you're just starting a pasture, or if you're reseeding, or if you're renovating, most people will just go to your co-op and buy a bag of pasture seed. You know what? You can do that, but there is a much smarter way to go about doing that. There are many different varieties of both grasses and legumes and even forbs. And over the years, the universities do what's called forage variety trials, and they develop different varieties of seed and plants on all sorts of different traits. For example, they're trying to improve traits such as cold hardiness, plants that will do better in the upper Midwest here, or maybe they're more drought tolerant, or disease resistant, insect resistant, or most specifically, we've done a lot of research. We've come a really long way in nutrition. So the varieties that you're picking today that have been developed have a lot more nutritive values than pasture seed from bygone eras. So if you pay attention to that, and you can actually go in and look at these trials to find out which ones do best. You want to look for ones that were done in the upper Midwest, specifically out of University of Minnesota or the University of Wisconsin, North Dakota or South Dakota State University. And I think Troy is on. He might be able to put some information on that in the chat. Otherwise, you can also just Google it too. Just look for forage variety trials. So don't just settle for any seed mixture that comes in the bag. You can really, really increase your production and your nutrition level based on better varieties. So one question I get very, very often is how many sheep and goats can you stock per acre? I hear that all the time. And generally people just want a simple answer. They want me to say 4 to 5, you know, and that's it. And, you know, it's not quite so simple as that. You can start with 4 to 5 in Minnesota. That's kind of a starting point. However, there's many different things that go into that answer. Because pasture stocking rates vary. It can vary because of your quality of your pastures, how much rainfall we get, the different species, what do you have growing in there, how much grass compared to forbs, you know, with legumes, and time of month, year, season, and your soil. Is it real dry and sandy? And in that case, it wouldn't hold much water or nutrients, or is it much more loamy or what? You know, so your soil structure and your fertility is going to mean a lot as to how many sheep or goats you can stock. And then your management practices will really contribute to how many animals you can have on that pasture system. Your grazing management style, whether it's continuous, rotational, or intensive, has a big effect. And we're going to talk about those and maybe help you set up some different types of systems, or at least understand the importance on setting up a different system, how it can really increase your bottom lines. So with that being said, these are my little examples of little sheep in there, but this is a continuous grazing system. So think of this as one big, large paddock or pasture. Let's just say that that's about 10 acres right there, okay? And you just basically, like a lot of people, just throw your animals out there. You don't want to put a lot of work into it, so you just throw your animals out there. This one is fairly cheap to construct. You just have to put in a good perimeter fence. You just have to have one water, and you throw your animals out there and away they go, right? Well, the problem with that, the disadvantage is these animals go out there and they select what they want to eat. And so they might go in there right away and they might just pick through and select the most tasty morsels they can find, which in this case would probably be if you have any alfalfa out there, they're going to eat that down first. And if they keep grazing that, pretty soon your alfalfa disappears out of that paddock completely. And or they might have some grass that they really like, and they'll go over and they'll eat that down, walk away, and another week that grass starts to regrow and it's real young and tender again. So they go back and they graze it again and again and again, and pretty soon that grass just quits growing. It just can't take the constant grazing, so it quits. So then you end up with big dirt patches basically in the area. And also you get lots of areas where animals congregate. You know, they like to congregate around the water, or maybe you have a shady area that they like to lay and rest in. And when you have animals that congregate, you also get real hot spots of parasites as well. What you'd rather have them do is spread out and spread their manure and their pellets and their parasites around instead of having real hot zones like that. So continuous grazing, it's very selective on the animal's part, and pastures can go bad real quick. I see a lot of pastures like this out in my area, and I think it's a real shame, because these animals that are out there on pastures where the grass or the forbs or the legumes are so overgrazed that these pastures are no longer providing a good level of nutrition for these animals. So in that case, then the farmer has to supplement those animals. Well, that's an additional cost. So why do it when you can just put in the extra money and the extra time and increase that? And we're going to look at how to do that next. One thing you can do is you can create a simple rotational grazing plan. So you can take that same 10-acre parcel, we're going to use as an example, and you still have your perimeter fence, but we're going to break that up into, you could either do it into 2 pastures, or in this case, we're going to look at 4. So now each section, instead of being 1 section of 10 acres, each section here is about 2.5. So what we're going to do is we're going to take those animals and we're going to send them in there, and we're going to pay good attention to them. We're going to pay attention to what they're eating. And being that this area is much smaller, they can't spread out and pick and select. They're going to go here and they're going to compete with each other, and they're going to bite off the top, most tastiest part. And then we're not going to let them eat that down too close or too low. Before that happens, we're going to move them into the next path. And then we're going to shut that gate. And then what we're going to do is we're going to let that first pasture have some time to rest and regrow back. We don't want to get it to the point that it can't save itself and that it will die off. We want to allow it time where it can regrow and regenerate. So now we've put those sheep or those goats into that next paddock, and this paddock here is at that vegetative state. It hasn't grown up yet. It's still young and tender and very nutritious. So those animals are getting a real high plane of nutrition. We might put them into the next paddock, we might put them into the next paddock, but our thing is to pay attention to them and move them before they eat too much of those plants down or trample them too much down too. We really want to keep the health of the plant in mind as well as the health of the animals. You can also do a very intensive rotational grazing. Here's an example where, I mean, you can make as many paddocks as you want. But in this case, you know, we're going to do 8, maybe a little over an acre a piece. And it's the same thing. In addition, what you can do is you can take your animals that have the highest nutritional needs. Now you can do this 2 ways. You could send all of your animals together into this first paddock and then rotate them through. However, you're going to have differences in animals. You're going to have those maintenance animals that are eating the same level of nutrition that these high energy need, your pregnant animals are going to need, or your lactating animals. So why give them, your maintenance animals, as much to eat as these other animals? Why not separate them? If you could separate them, that way you could send in the first animals being the ones that have the highest nutritional needs. So they go in first. Let's say we're going to send in your pairs, your ewes and lambs, or your does and their kids, and they've got a great nutritional need. So they go in there first. Your grass is fairly tall. There's a lot of quality or quantity as well as quality. It's still, you know, very nutritious at that point. It's easy to digest. And most importantly, it's tall enough so that the parasites aren't going crazy. If you'll remember on Tuesday, Dr. Whitney talked about, you know, those young animals have a very weakened immune system when they're young, or their immune system hasn't developed yet. And at that point, we don't want to send them into a paddock that's very grazed down where those parasites are popping like crazy. If we can send them out into an area where that grass is taller, and if you'll remember from Tuesday's talk too, you know, those parasites, well, you generally stay down in 2 to 3 inches, but they can migrate up to about 4 or 5 inches. So if your pastures are taller than that, you're really going to decrease that parasite level, which is especially important for those young animals going in. Anyways, we'll get back to it. So then they go into that first paddock, we move them into the second, and we're going to keep rotating them through. We're going to really pay attention. This might happen daily. You know, if we have enough animals in there, they're going to eat that down quick, but we don't want to let them eat that down too much. So we're going to move them into the next paddock, into the next, into the next. After that, we could send in the next batch of animals, the ones with lower nutritional needs, the ones, like I said, on maintenance, the ones that maybe the dry ewes or your yearlings or maybe your wethers, send them in. So as the one thing to keep in mind is you have to pay good attention as you're coming through here into that vegetative state. If if your animals aren't eating fast enough and your grass is growing faster and it starts getting to that overly mature stage, and it starts to flower and then it starts to seed, remember that pasture quality is or those forage qualities is gonna really dip down and you're gonna lose that quality. So at that point, you need to send it back into a vegetative state. So you could either go in there and mow it, or you could hay it, which would also help with some parasite issues. But you can throw those plants into a vegetative state by managing them, by going in there and forcing them to go back into a vegetative state. Let's see, so we've talked about with our forage basics, types of forages, the varieties, the growth stages, all of those, you've got pretty great control over that. The next thing with our forages, we're going to talk about our soil, rainfall, and temperature. Let's see. So first of all, know what soil type you have. This is so important. Soil is the heart and soul of your pasture. Remember, you've probably all heard the phrase or the term, the healthy soil, healthy plants, healthy animals. It's very, very true. If you want to raise healthy animals, they have to have very healthy forage. If you want healthy forage, it all starts with your soil. So it really determines how well your plants will grow. You can't do anything really to change its structure. If your structure being, if it's soil, silt, clay, there's not a whole lot you can do other than add some organic matter to it. But there's different things you can do as far as fertility. What you really should do is start with the basic soil test. Your soil test will cover the structure. It'll tell you what parts, sand, silt, clay, your organic matter, your pH. Different grasses and plants prefer different pH levels, and your fertility needs. If you plan on fertilizing, your soil test will tell you exactly what you need in order to grow those plants. Soils vary considerably in their ability to support plant growth. So yeah, very important to know. And also, I don't know if somebody wants to throw in the chat maybe some information on soil testing labs. That's also in my resources at the end of this presentation. But you can either take a sample to your local co-op, or our University of Minnesota has a soil testing lab. I think it's like $15 to do that, but it gives you a really good starting point for your plants. Rainfall, obviously there is nothing we can do about rainfall. However, there's a lot of planning you can do. And rainfall can vary so much. So, don't just plan your system based on what the rainfall is this year. It can vary considerably from year to year. I know 10, 15 years ago, we had probably the worst drought years that I can remember. And now the last few years, we've had just an incredible amount of rainfall. So anything that you can do with that in mind, you may have years where it's very dry and other years where it's very wet. So if you can put paddocks in, say at the top of a hill, and so those years where it's very wet, your animals can be up there and the forage could be dried out, and you could get more life out of it. You could also put some paddocks down at the bottom of the hill for those years when it's very dry. The bottom of the hills will retain moisture better, and again, you'll get more forage out of it. So, consider rainfall over long periods of time. And then, of course, sometimes there is absolutely nothing we can do, and we're just going to see a slump. And at that point, as with these animals here, we'll just have to do supplemental feeding. One other thing to think about is the temperature. Most all of our forages that we grow in Minnesota are cool season grasses. Just like your lawn, they tend to grow better and do a lot better in the spring and in the fall when the temperatures are cooler. So we have to plan around that. And there are ways that we need to remember that, and that ways that we can fill in those areas. So if you look at this chart here, you can see, let's say this area here is probably late April. The grasses are really small. And not only that, but pay attention to the roots. The roots too are very small, young, and weak. That plant is weak at that point. But then as we go into May and into June, those shoot growth is really taking off, and the roots are coming in really good. But then we have the summer slump. Once it gets hot and dry, our grasses pretty much quit growing, as well as their roots too. And I just think if you had an animal that came by right then and really started grazing that really hard, those plants would die pretty quick. And then in the fall, we have a continued root growth again and shoot growth. And come late fall, as those plants start to shut down, we want to leave some of that growth. We don't want to overgraze, because it's really important that those roots stay healthy as they go into winter, so that they can start all over again in the fall, or excuse me, in the spring. This is an old chart, but I really, really like it. What it does is, if you look over to the left, the top of there, it shows some of our common cool season grasses: Kentucky bluegrass, orchard grass, quackgrass, etc. And then you can see the months that they do the best, which, as I said, May, June, beginning parts of July, but then we hit that slump. And all through August, you know, nothing in that cool season grass category is really doing very well at all. And then they start picking up again in September. But then if you look down on your legumes, you can kind of fill in some of that slump area if you diversify and put in some alfalfa, maybe some bird's foot, some clovers. You can get a little bit more growth and kind of fill in those areas. And then with the beauty of having sheep and goats, you know, they like more of those forbes and the brush. And you can really fill those areas in a lot more with some of those plants. And the brush especially can take you farther out into October. And with buckthorn, my property had a lot of buckthorn, which extended my grazing production system well into November, and one year even into December. So again, we're pretty lucky with having the sheep and goats, because we can really extend their grazing preferences and our grazing systems based on their preferences. Just another chart that was really good. I think the takeaway point out of here that I would like you to know is, well, we'll look at this more. We don't have a whole lot of time to look at it, but another good chart. Now I will show you where to get this at the end of the presentation, but this just talks about which grasses and which legumes have a better potential for regrowth, which ones are good for winter hardiness, which ones tolerate drought more. So you can kind of select things based on your system. And this is the one I want the takeaway point for you to be, is look at, just from managing your pastures, how much more pounds of digestible matter you can get, or dry matter you can get in the quality. Let's look at bluegrass alone. If you have good quality pastures, look at the difference in the yield as compared to poor qualities. I mean, that's huge, and that goes to show with all of these different grasses as well as your legumes. As far as what makes good or poor, a lot of that has to do with soil fertility. If you have a good fertility plan, you can increase that yield. And then if you have a good varieties, and if you do a good rotational grazing system, you can just greatly increase that yield. So you can imagine, if you can be a good manager of your pastures and your paddocks, you may have more than enough yield to supply good quality nutrition to all of your animals without any supplemental feeding. And so diversity is the key. I mean, the best thing, I mean, I hope you understand that with the more different types of plants we can put into our systems, the more we can fill in those gaps where others might not do well. They're going to be much more productive. They're going to be less prone to diseases and insects. It broadens the nutritional opportunities of the grazing animals. They can be they have much more choice, and which is going to offer them much more nutrition. And your legumes, they provide nitrogen for the grass and improve overall diet quality. As I said, they tend to be higher in protein, your alfalfa, and bird's foot trefoil and your clovers, and they also provide the nitrogen. Consider incorporating more forbs, trees, and shrubs. Of course, like I said, most of our grazing systems are pretty conventional with just grasses, but anything we can do as a sheep and goat producer to increase more of these, we're just going to have happier, healthier animals. And also, I just want to talk a little bit about root systems. Here, I'm going to look at our time quick, okay? With our root systems, again, when you're out walking your pastures and you're considering on when to move those animals into their next paddock, just consider this with their root systems. If you allow that animal to take off 50% of the plant, okay, the roots don't stop growing. They're still growing. They're still collecting food. The leaves are still photosynthesizing and producing energy. That's still a healthy plant, and it's going to put out more leaf structure after it's been grazed and continue in a vegetative stage and be a happy, healthy, productive plant. However, if you have your animal come in and you let it take 70% of that plant, there's only 30% left, 50% of those roots stop growing. So if it stops growing, it's going to be a lot harder for that plant to recover. If you let that animal or those animals continue to come in and graze and regraze, horses are notorious for doing this. They will graze and regraze and regraze and eat that and eat that and eat that. But if you get down to 90%, 100% of those roots will quit growing. So think about that in the fall time on these perennial grasses. You really need to have a good root structure going into the winter time so that come spring, it's got a good root structure to start sending that food up to that plant in the spring. If you go into fall and into winter with hardly any root structure at all, that plant is really going to struggle come spring. It might not even make it over the winter. And so you've really set yourself back. The benefit, I mean, the beauty really of having a good quality forage system. I mean, I love this picture here. We've got some late pregnancy ewes. They're actually gaining weight. There's no supplemental feed going on. You can see there's some young ones being born. We had talked about, you know, just the whole nutritional plane. So this provides everything they need here. Probably the only thing that could make this any better is that there were more forbs in here for the sheep, which the sheep really enjoy. And this too. This case here, these were my own sheep, and these are first in on my rotational grazing system. So the grass was growing up pretty good size right here. These are the first ones coming into these clean new paddocks. These ewes here have a really high nutritional need. They're feeding these little ones. I want them to have a pretty high average daily gain, right? They're just starting not only drinking off of their mamas, but they're starting to nibble on some grasses as well. I would like to point out that you know, you have to remember too that grasses, there's a really high water content in grasses. If you think about how much water your animals drink in the winter when you're feeding them hay and how little water they drink in the summer, it's because they're getting so much of their water just in the grasses that they're eating. Now, with that being said, when they're eating so much grass, sometimes they don't get enough nutrition in them that way to give them the biggest average daily gain that these young ones can get. So you might want to keep that in mind, and there is a little trick that you can do to that. A lot of people like to keep the animals in the barn overnight, feed them some hay or some grains in the morning, especially with those young ones where you're trying to get those weights up, and let them eat for a while off that before you send them out. A second benefit of that is what you're doing in the morning. Think about how much dew is on that grass in the morning. If you'll remember Dr. Whitney's talk on Tuesday, you know, that's how your parasites migrate up the grass blade is they migrate up. You know, they're not crawling up that grass blade, they're migrating up through the moisture on there. So if you can keep those animals off first thing in the morning when there's a lot of dew, you can avoid a lot of parasite infestations as well. Over in New Zealand, they do that very often. That's a big way that they help monitor, keep their parasite levels down, just holding them off pasture in the morning until all of that dries up. I want to go back to this picture quickly because I want to show you, I don't know if you can see in the very back area back there, that back area is not used, it's not fenced off, but it was planted in pasture. You can see there's lots of yellow out there, yellow spots, that's dandelions, maybe some, I don't know what it all is, but you can see there's a lot of it in that back area that isn't grazed. It's the same pasture and forage system that I have up in this area, but this area is picked clean. You can see those are the ones that those animals really prefer, so they're going to eat those first. So when you put them into a rotational, a highly or intense rotational grazing system, they'll still pick the ones that they like the best first, but then they're going to quickly start eating the other ones before we move them off again. And then after that, I send in the cleanup team. So after my first animals go through there and they get the highest level of nutrition off of there, and then I'll send in these folks. These are the ones that, you know, they get fat off of breathing air and they don't need a high level of nutrition. These might be some of my wethers or dry ewes. So they come in next. I also clean in or send in my little parasite vacuum cleaners, I call them. As Dr. Whitney talked about on Tuesday, oftentimes animals, different species can come in and they can break up those parasite cycles because they don't share the same parasites as the sheep and goats. So these donkeys, they can eat the parasites, but they will not be infected with them. And same with chickens. Chickens actually make really good additions to these pastures because they like to scratch and peck and they break up those little pellets. So a great one to incorporate into your pasture system. And I also just want to talk about noxious weeds quickly because people often ask, you know, what plants are poisonous to sheep and goats? And again, not such a simple answer because mostly livestock do not typically eat poisonous plants unless your pastures are really overly grazed and they have nothing else to eat. I've often watched my own animals. I've seen them go in there and pick at something that might be poisonous. However, they're going to do a quick little taste and then they move on. They're not consuming enough for it to be actually bad for them. However, it is still really, and there are some things, I mean, oops, excuse me, if you get out into, if they get into your yard, there's a lot of ornamentals that are much more poisonous than some of our pasture plants. But one thing you should really be aware of in your own property are knowing which weeds are noxious. There is a noxious weed list, and you can find that online. This book here I absolutely love. It's our noxious weed list. It's put out by the Minnesota Department of Transportation. You can get it online. You are responsible if you have noxious weeds on your property to eradicate them. And one of the main reasons you would want to do that is because they can be harmful to both livestock and humans, some of these. So know what they are and eradicate them as you can. And then we've got some of my favorite Minnesota grazing resources. I'm going to leave you with these. First of all, I want to give a shout out to our University of Minnesota Extension educators. Not all counties have extension educators, but you can go to this link here and you can click on your county to see if you do have a county educator. And a lot of our counties have agricultural educators, so they can help you with pasture questions and problems or help direct you to somebody that can help you with nutritional questions and all sorts of information, in addition to a lot of the different workshops that we put on. Your soil and water conservation district are just a wealth of information. They too can really help you greatly with your pastures and looking at the lay of your land. In a lot of cases, they'll come out to your property and walk it with you. They can help you look at areas that you might not consider when you're putting in your fencing system, like knowing where you know, some of your your sensitive areas are that you might want to avoid. And in addition, my favorite thing about the Soil and Water Conservation District is they have a tree sale, a tree and shrub sale. You can order them in the fall and pick them up in the spring, and they sell them in quantities of 25 trees or shrubs a piece for a very, very reasonable price. So check out, you can go to this link here and click on your county, and it will bring you to the Soil and Water Conservation District in your area. Check out their tree and shrub sale. It's fabulous. And I forgot to mention that the DNR also sells huge quantities of trees and shrubs. Those are in higher ordered numbers though. Those are in packages of 500 trees at a time, or shrubs. Both the Soil and Water and DNR, in a lot of cases, they have equipment that you can rent that will help you to plant those on large scales. NRCS, the Natural Resource Conservation Service, is another excellent resource for pasture helper management. They actually have 2 state grazing specialists. They too will come out to your property. They will walk it with you. They will help recommend different forages and varieties, help you set up grazing systems, a wealth of information. Again, another free service. The Sustainable Farming Association, they put on lots of educational programs. They put on the Garlic Festival, but a lot of field tours and field walks. I'm sure it will be cut down this summer with COVID, but pay attention to their website because some of their field tours are just fabulous. Great way to connect with other people who are doing similar things. The Land Stewardship Project, another great one, especially for new farmers. They have they have a program called the Farm Beginnings Program. I actually went through it myself in the late 90s, and it's fabulous for new people getting into grazing. Again, they can really help you through things. They can help you with your goal setting, introduce you to other farmers, set you up with mentors, which is very important. I can't say enough how important it is to go and visit other farms that have rotational grazing systems so you can see how other people have done things. And more importantly, they can teach you what not to do. It's better to learn by their mistakes than your own. The Minnesota Noxious Weed List that we talked about is there. MISA, which is it's the Institute of Sustainable Agriculture, which is also part of the University of Minnesota Extension. We have a meat goat listserv, a dairy goat listserv, sheep listserv. You can go in there, you can subscribe. They're not very active anymore, but you can subscribe. And if you have questions, you can just send an email and everybody who's subscribed will get that and they can respond. We often post our events coming up on those listservs. And then lastly, here's the link for the UMN soil testing lab. It's about $15 per test for your basic test. And you can go up in price if you want a more comprehensive list than that. So, and let's see, these are both Minnesota-based guides. These are my favorite guides ever. They're both old, about 20 years old, but I still use them today. Their information is fabulous. You will learn so much from either of these. Both of these can be downloaded for free. And instead of me putting up a really big long link, just go in and Google them because there's many different websites that have these on their website. So just Google the names and yeah, read them, study them. After this class, if you want additional, if you're interested in additional grazing, like maybe a grazing 102, put it in the chat and we'll look and see what we can do. With that said, I want to thank you all for coming to this session, as well as I really want to thank you for coming to all 4 of these sessions that we put on for sheep and goat producers. So again, if you have any more questions, please share them into the chat and we will stay on and for as long as it takes to answer your questions. So let's see. Also, we have everybody's names who have spoken during these 4 sections, their name and their contact emails are on here. we love to hear from you. If you have any additional questions about any of these sessions, please contact us and we'll be glad to answer. As well as our panelists are also listed on there. There's a lot of people that worked really hard to bring this information to you. We really hope you enjoyed these presentations.
Bridget, or Brenda, we've been able to answer some of the questions as we've gone along here.
Okay.
But one of the questions is what types of forages do you recommend to intentionally introduce pastures for sheep? And Troy answered plantain and chicory are the best for this region. Are there others that you could recommend? And maybe Travis would have some ideas too.
Yeah, I agree with Troy. And remember, looking at that graph, that sheep really prefer a lot of forbes type things. So yeah, the chicory, the plantain. Let's see, the bird's foot trefoil is a good one. I like that because I didn't talk at all about tannins, but there are some plants that have tannins in them, which are showing some good signs of helping to prevent parasites. So I would look at maybe some of those. I'm trying to find my chat on here, by the way. It's not showing up.
You're trying to look at this chat, Brenda?
Oh, there it goes. Okay, yep.
Okay, well, I'll ask you the question.
Okay,
so
great.
Yep. So how long do you need to leave a pasture unglazed to ensure that it is clean of monstrous?
Ungrazed, I'm assuming you mean?
Yeah,
And then,
ungrazed.
And then for what? Can you repeat that?
Yep, it's
homunculus.
Okay, now this is a hard one because if you were there on Tuesday when we talked to you listened to Dr. Whitney, you learned that those parasites can stay inside for 4 to 6 months. So that animal can be shedding those for 4 to 6 months. So ideally in a perfect world, if you could leave that pasture empty for the full entire year, that would be wonderful. However, that is not very practical at all, and no one can really do that. So your other choice would be to know that those pastures are still being infected. So what can you do about that? Well, as we talked about, you can let those forages grow up taller because we know that those parasites are most active in the first 2 to 3 inches. And we need good rain and good moisture and good dew for them to migrate up. So anything you can do to ensure that those grasses are taller. In addition, some of your browse, all of that is up off the ground. That, especially for those goats, there's no parasite in the world that can climb that high. So introducing more browse into your pasture system would really be helpful.
Okay. You said that plants have tannins. Please explain the benefit or risk.
Sure. There are some plants that have what's called tannins. And tannins have been, they're showing some great promise in helping to, I don't know if it actually, I think it suppresses the parasites from infecting the animals. A lot of research is going down in the southern states. One plant called Sericea lespedeza is showing great promise. However, that won't grow up here in Minnesota, or it can become a problem. So we don't have that up here. If you can get a hold of things like hay or pellets, that can help. We do have some plants that have tannins in them. And those plants up here in Minnesota would be things like bird's foot trefoil, oak trees, acorns. However, they do have tannins in them. There just hasn't been a lot of research on how much those animals need to ingest in order to really to help with the parasites. But we just do know with the research down in Georgia with the Sericea lespedeza that tannins are helpful. They're not hurt. They don't hurt.
What are some forbs and grasses that you would want to have for goats? So kind of the same question about the one you answered about the sheep. Same thing for goats, great for planting or overseeding.
Well, remember, going back to that one chart on what goats prefer, you know, grasses are not their favorite foods. I think it was only like, what was it, 20%? Mm-hmm. And, you know, I spend a lot of time observing my animals, and yeah, my goats do eat grass. They pick a little here, they'll go over and pick a little there of different things. But however, you know, their preference is really browse. So anything you can do to incorporate some more, you know, bushes, shrubs, trees. If you don't have any on your pasture, you know, maybe fence off some areas and contact the Soil and Water Conservation District, and you can go out and buy, you know, I mean, lilacs. My goats love my lilacs, and you can buy, you know, 25 of them for very cheap and start planting them. They're going to take a while to grow. Maybe you could rent out some pastures. You know, I actually sent a bunch of my goats off to with the DNR one year, and they allowed me to send my animals to a wildlife area and graze some property where they were trying to control some invasive weeds. So it worked out really good for me. It worked out really good for them. But remember, grasses are probably not the goat's favorite thing to eat. But if you can incorporate some forbs, some legumes, including alfalfa and clovers, and some trees and shrubs, that will be much appreciated and well utilized.
Brenda, thank you for that. Attendee Karen shares that she had chicory and her sheep loved it and pretty much demolished it. It couldn't handle regrazing the way grasses do. Yeah. How do you maintain it? What forbs can handle being grazed, say, twice a year?
Chicory. Troy, what do you know about chicory? Chicory, I believe, isn't chicory an annual? Troy, are you in here?
My internet connect is not real.
Oh, no. Okay.
It requires much longer rest periods. And so from that standpoint, it really requires special management. You don't have a lot of other forbs to browse. They'll demolish it very quickly.
And you know, and I think that's true with a lot of our annuals. There's so much that we could do with annuals. However, they do require a different system. They don't do real good if we just interseed them in with our perennial grasses. And it's the same with our warm season grasses. They just compete too much with our cold season. So unless you have their own specific area to grow them, they really don't do well being incorporated with other forages.
Yeah. So Brenda, the question too, what forbs are you recommending? Do we go back to that chart?
Yeah, let's see. Forbs, you know, I mean, a lot of them just naturally, I mean, dandelions are amazing. You know, I started out at one time working with a lot of horse producers who could not stand to have a single dandelion in their grass pasture, but I've really learned to value dandelions are fabulous. And a lot of those just natural forbs that get blown in are just so wonderful. If we can encourage them, and they will grow, if we can encourage them to grow by not overgrazing and let natural stuff come in, I think is really great. As far as buying seed for forbs, you could probably buy some, contact some places like some of our pasture, or not pasture, but our prairie renovation places. However, I know the seed is going to be pretty expensive. But again, that might be a little bit more difficult to incorporate into an already established grass system.
My experience, Brenda, has been some of these forbs that we're talking, like plantain, that grows in your garden, or in areas of unused pasture,
Yep.
Untiled areas, areas where there's a little bit more compaction in the soil as well. And that's what makes it so great for grazing, because it's not so great for traditional row crops.
Absolutely. And again, another thing that just comes in naturally, you don't have to seed.
One question here coming from Colorado is, they have bindweed that is invasive. Is that good for anything?
Bindweed. It's invasive. I don't know. Honestly, I don't know. If the goats, I would probably eat that. I don't know why they wouldn't. I don't know that it's.
Yeah,
I guess I'm not real sure.
One comment here too is bindweed chokes out other beneficial weeds.
And I'm sure, and it could also choke out other things as well. Any of those types of vining type weeds can smother and suffocate things. So you would want to kind of watch that, as far as also, smothering out trees and shrubs too.
Yeah.
They tend to like to climb things.
Yeah. Okay. I'm just going to ask Brenda Miller, is there any questions that I've missed here?
There was one that says, so I have 40 acres of land, but a lot of it is swamp. So how should I move the goats as far as rotating?
Ooh. Yeah, I mean, swamp is has so many problems. I mean, any way you can keep away from that swamp, obviously. I mean, for one, there's just so many problems with a swamp. For one, goats don't like to get their little tootsies wet. And two, anything that's wet and moist is just a breeding paradise for parasites. I don't know where that swamp goes to, but water features are sensitive. Chances are that swamp is running into something. So you want to be real careful with your water and make sure that you're not polluting that. So I'm assuming you would just have to fence around that swamp and try to get those animals to any high ground you can get. I'm not sure if that actually answers your question.
I can jump in on the swampy pasture. Ideally, you'd be fencing off the areas that are entirely swampy, right, and not allowing goats access there in general. But really, what you should do is be mapping those pastures so that you know what is actually usable grass, usable forage for your animals, so that you have an acreage that includes everything, but you also have a usable acreage. So then you can manage that accordingly based on your stocking densities and everything, based on what you actually is usable, or what you see as usable out in that pasture. So I think anytime I run into a lot of swamp, we get into a lot of mapping, looking at things on Google Earth, looking at walking the pastures and actually trying to figure out what's there and what's usable.
Right, absolutely. And remember, some of these years where we get a lot more rain, those swamps may really grow to a lot more area than you ever realized. In addition, there, parasites, there's all sorts of parasites of concern too. There's the liver flukes and yeah, so anything that has to do with swamp, I would stay away from.
Another comment that's popular with cattle is clipping the grass. Not necessarily, but for grazing, to keep the seed heads from forming. And do you have any recommendations about that, Brenda?
Oh, absolutely. We talked about that a little bit when we were talking about the intensive rotational grazing. You need to keep an eye on that pasture. Once those plants start to flower, and remember, grasses flower too. They produce the flower, and once they flower, they really start losing their nutritional quality fast. So it's at that point, what you want to do is you want to go in there and you either want to graze them or you want to cut them yourself by mowing or haying. And once you clip them, mow them, hay them, you will send that plant back into a vegetative state. So it will start to produce new leaves, new tender leaves, and new tender nutritious leaves. So yeah, never let your plants get to that point where they go to flower and then to seed, because at that point you've really lost your nutritional quality, and then those plants have become stemmy, and they have a lot higher fiber content. However, I shouldn't say never do that, because at that point too, I mean, that's not bad forage. If you have animals with a lower nutritional need, that they could still utilize that. Instead of you mowing it, you could send those animals in there to clip and graze. So that might be a good way to handle that too.
Brenda, I have a question.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Brenda, a question for you. Do you utilize extended rest periods to produce seed to reseed the pastures if the pastures are getting thin?
I haven't. I mean, I guess no, I shouldn't say I haven't. I have done that. However, I haven't, or I didn't really see much benefit to doing that. I got more benefit out of being a little bit more intentional about reseeding. So I did it maybe 1 or 2 years and really didn't see a benefit to it. So whereas if I cut that grass and kept it at a vegetative stage, I could utilize that grass as a good quality forage instead of letting it go to seed. So has anybody else on the panel, do they have any input or ideas or suggestions on that? That was just my experience.
When I let things go to seed and try to do that, I tend to think about it as, like between 1/4 and 1/2 in terms of percentage as effective as intentionally reseeding.
Yeah.
So I think you can do it, and it can have some benefit. You just have to plan on it not being as effective as intentional reseeding.
Yeah, I agree.
An attendee commented that they let the field of grass go to seed and it did not help.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate having attendees input as well. There's always a lot of wealth of information in our audience. So yeah, if anybody else has any feedback, feel free to put those in the chats as well.
I think another thing to keep into consideration there, even as we go through rotational grazing, is even though that there's a lot of moisture and waters in those grasses, is make sure that obviously that you allow a water source for those animals. And so sometimes that gets forgotten. And so we need to be careful that if we want to do 8 paddocks, is that we need to either identify a location that they can have a central water spot or to bring one to them within their area.
Very good point and very important. And I meant to talk about that because yes, never ever hold back on their water. Regardless of how much you might think they're getting out of their pasture, they always have to have in each one of those paddocks, they need to have a water source. And of course, that could be an additional cost when you're doing intensive rotational grazing. However, it's necessary.
Those are all the questions that I'm seeing. Brenda, Miller, Colleen, do you see any? We have one. Do you recommend shade?
Oh, absolutely. I like to put my lawn chair right under the biggest tree. But yeah, you know, shade is really great because if you're out observing your pastures, the shady areas that the grass tends to grow better. You know, it's shaded from the hot sun. It doesn't dry out as quick. It stays cooler longer. So those areas definitely seem to thrive better in the shade. Of course, if it's too shady and it's not getting enough sunlight, well, then that can go the opposite way. But some shade is always good. And of course, the animals really enjoyed that, especially in the hot days of summer. They like to go under the shade trees and ruminate, which is definitely a good thing, I think.
Thank you. Yep, it looks like we are done with questions unless anyone has any last minute ones. Colleen, Brenda, do you see any more that have been unanswered?
I think you got them all.
Great. Well, thanks for joining us. If you haven't filled out the poll, we'd really appreciate it. We sincerely use your feedback. So anything you're willing to share with us will help us tailor our future programming.